Picture this. It's 30,000 years ago. Your small band of maybe 20 people has been walking for 3 days straight. You're somewhere in what will eventually become Central Asia, though obviously nobody's calling it that yet. The ground is frozen, food is running low, and at the back of the group, struggling to keep pace, is the oldest member of your clan. A woman, maybe 55 years old, which in this world makes her ancient. Her knees are going, her teeth are worn down to almost nothing. She can't run, she can't carry much. And the group has a decision to make. We like to think we know what happened next. We picture something brutal, something cold. A human being left behind in the snow while the rest of the group walked away without looking back. It's the image that comes up every time someone talks about ancient attitudes toward the elderly. Survival of the fittest. No room for weakness. That's just how it was. Except that's not quite the story. Or at least, it's not the whole story. And the real story is considerably more complicated, more uncomfortable, and in some ways, far more interesting than the simple version we've been telling ourselves. Here's what we actually know. Archaeological evidence going back tens of thousands of years tells us that ancient humans did, in some cases, leave elderly or severely injured members behind. There's no point pretending otherwise. The fossil record is honest, even when we'd rather it wasn't. But that same record also shows us something that almost never makes it into the popular version of this story. It shows ancient humans caring for the elderly, carrying the injured, nursing the sick, in conditions that make our modern lives look almost absurdly comfortable by comparison. So which is it? Did ancient humans abandon their elderly, or did they protect them? The answer, it turns out, is yes. Both. And the reasons why tell us something deeply unsettling, not just about who our ancestors were, but about the impossible calculations that define what it means to keep a group alive when there is no margin for error whatsoever. By the end of this, you're going to look at the way we treat aging, today, right now, in the world you actually live in, completely differently. Because it turns out the dilemmas our ancestors faced in the frozen wilderness are a lot closer to the ones we're still facing than anyone wants to admit. Let's get into it. Let's start by killing the myth, because there is a version of this story that gets repeated constantly, in documentaries, in history classes, in casual conversation. And it goes something like this. Ancient humans were brutal pragmatists. Resources were scarce. The old and the weak slowed everyone down. So they were left behind. Simple, clean, logical. The prehistoric equivalent of a corporate layoff. Nothing personal, just survival math. The problem is that the archaeological record doesn't back this up. Not cleanly, not even close. Let's take one of the most famous examples in all of paleoanthropology. A Neanderthal skeleton discovered in Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, dating back roughly 45,000 years. The man researchers called Shanidar I had survived to what was, for that era, a genuinely remarkable age. But here's the detail that changes everything. He had done it with a withered right arm, likely amputated or paralyzed from an early age. Severe damage to his left leg, partial blindness, bone degeneration across multiple joints. This was not a man who could hunt. This was not a man who could carry supplies across frozen terrain or keep up during a fast retreat from a predator. By the cold logic of pure survival pragmatism, he should have been left behind decades before he died. He wasn't. Someone fed him. Someone kept him warm. Someone in that group made a sustained, repeated decision over years that this person was worth the cost. And Shanidar I is not an isolated case. Across dozens of ancient burial sites on multiple continents, researchers have found skeletal remains of individuals who lived for years, sometimes decades, with injuries and conditions that would have made independent survival completely impossible. A healed femur fracture from 300,000 years ago in a hominin fossil from China. Severe spinal deformities in individuals who reached old age in prehistoric European populations. The bones don't lie. These people were kept alive by the people around them. So where does the abandonment narrative actually come from? Partly from a handful of well-documented cases that are real. Partly from a 19th and early 20th century tendency to project a certain kind of ruthless rationalism onto the past. And partly, if we're honest, because the brutal version of the story is just easier to digest than the complicated one. The truth is that ancient humans were doing something far messier and far more recognizable than simple abandonment. They were making impossible choices under impossible conditions. And sometimes the choice went one way. and sometimes it went the other. The question is, what determined which way it went? So what actually drove the decision? When did a group keep their elderly, and when did they not? This is where the science gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the answer isn't cruelty. It isn't indifference. It's math. Brutal, inescapable survival math that operated on a level so fundamental, it shaped the structure of entire societies. Start with the basic reality of nomadic life. A hunter-gatherer group on the move carries everything it owns on its back. There are no wagons, no pack animals, no infrastructure of any kind. Every single object the group possesses has to be physically transported by a human body across whatever terrain the season demands. That means every member of the group has to contribute roughly as much as they consume. Not perfectly, not every single day, but over time, the equation has to roughly balance. When it stops balancing, people die. Not metaphorically, literally. Anthropologists who have studied modern hunter-gatherer societies, the ones that survive long enough to be documented, found that the threshold wasn't heartless. Groups would carry injured members for remarkably long distances. They would redistribute food to those who couldn't hunt or forage. They would slow their pace for weeks at a time to allow recovery from illness. The tolerance for dependency was genuinely higher than the brutal pragmatist narrative suggests. But it had a ceiling. And that ceiling was determined by one thing above all others: whether the group itself would survive if they maintained it. Here's the specific calculation researchers have reconstructed. In a group of 20 people crossing difficult terrain with limited food, a single fully dependent member, meaning someone consuming resources while contributing nothing and requiring additional carrying capacity, could reduce the group's overall survival odds by a significant margin. Not a rounding error, a meaningful, potentially fatal reduction. Add 2 fully dependent members, and the math shifts dramatically. 3, and you are looking at a scenario where the group faces a genuine choice between the few and the many. And this is where it gets archaeologically verifiable. Studies of skeletal remains from nomadic prehistoric populations show a striking pattern. Individuals with conditions that would have caused partial dependency, reduced mobility, diminished strength, survived at rates comparable to healthier group members. Individuals whose conditions would have created total dependency show a very different survival profile. The line wasn't drawn at weakness. It was drawn at total, unrecoverable dependency with no foreseeable end. The decision, when it came, wasn't made by monsters. It was made by people who loved the person they were leaving. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. But here's what almost never gets mentioned when people talk about ancient attitudes toward the elderly. The old were not just mouths to feed. In a world with no written language, no libraries, no internet, no external storage of any kind, an elderly person was something our modern minds genuinely struggle to fully appreciate. They were a hard drive, a living, breathing archive of everything the group needed to survive. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. The oldest member of a prehistoric band might be the only person alive who remembered the last severe drought. The only one who knew which roots were safe to eat when the preferred food sources disappeared. The only one who had seen this particular disease move through a camp before and knew what it did next. The only one who remembered where water could be found 3 weeks east when the closer sources dried up. That knowledge was not written down anywhere. It existed in exactly one place, inside that person's head. Lose them, and it was gone forever. Anthropologists have a term for this. They call it the grandmother hypothesis. First proposed in the 1990s by researcher Kristen Hawkes, studying the Hadza people of Tanzania, it argues that the evolutionary reason human females survive so far past reproductive age, something almost unique in the animal kingdom, is precisely because post-reproductive women provided survival-critical knowledge and childcare that dramatically increased the survival odds of their grandchildren. In evolutionary terms, a grandmother who helps 3 grandchildren survive contributes more to the gene pool than she would by having additional children herself. The math actually favors keeping her alive, and the fossil record supports this in ways that are hard to dismiss. Studies of Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens populations show a notable increase in the proportion of older individuals surviving into what we'd call old age, right around the same period that cultural complexity started accelerating. More old people surviving coincides directly with more sophisticated tools, more diverse diets, more complex social structures. The correlation is not subtle, which means that in many prehistoric groups, The elderly weren't just tolerated out of sentiment, they were strategically essential. The elder who remembered where the herd moved in a bad winter wasn't a burden on the group. They were potentially the difference between the group making it through that winter or not. Protecting them wasn't charity, it was an investment with the highest possible return. The question was always whether the body could still deliver what the mind contained. And when the answer was yes, ancient humans often went to extraordinary lengths to make sure that person stayed alive. So here's where we land, and here's where it gets personal. Ancient humans didn't have a policy on the elderly. They didn't have a philosophy, a legal framework, or a cultural consensus that said, here is what we do with the old. What they had was a recurring, agonizing, case-by-case negotiation between love and logistics, between memory and mobility, between what a person meant to the group and what the group could afford to carry. Sometimes that negotiation ended one way, sometimes it ended the other, and the people making those decisions were not fundamentally different from you. That last part is the one that tends to make people uncomfortable. Because we live in a world where we have made different choices, where we have built nursing homes and Medicare and hospice care and entire institutional systems designed to ensure that nobody gets left behind in the wilderness. And we are right to have built those things. That is genuine moral progress, and it deserves to be called that without qualification. But here's the uncomfortable mirror this history holds up. We still make resource allocation decisions about the elderly every single day. We make them in hospital budget meetings and insurance coverage debates and policy discussions about Social Security solvency. We make them when we decide how much of the national budget goes toward elder care versus other priorities. We make them as individuals when we calculate how much of our own lives we can restructure around an aging parent who needs increasing levels of support. The wilderness is gone. The math never left. What changed is not the fundamental tension. What changed is the scale at which we can absorb it. A wealthy modern society can carry its dependent members in ways that a band of 20 people crossing frozen terrain simply could not. The ceiling is higher, dramatically higher. But it is still there, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not paying attention to the conversations happening right now in legislatures and hospital ethics committees and family living rooms across the country. Our ancestors made impossible choices under impossible conditions with nothing but their judgment and their love and their fear to guide them. Some of those choices were wrong. Some were the only choices available. The honest thing, the actually useful thing, is not to judge them from the comfort of a world they built for us. It's to recognize that the question they were asking, how do we take care of the people who can no longer take care of themselves without destroying the community that surrounds them, is the same question we are still asking. We just have more tools. We don't yet have a final answer.